Welcome to the STEM Confidence Podcast, where we talk about how to turn your data into powerful insights. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the STEM Confidence Podcast. In this episode, we are going to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is scientific writing. As a STEM professional, you might often find yourself in the need to express your results or findings in writing, usually in the form of reports, funding applications, articles, or academic papers. And since I know from experience that for a lot of people, writing isn't a task they love, I wanted to dedicate an episode to scientific writing and share some insights and tips. I believe the reason why writing might be an unpleasant task for so many people is that putting your ideas into words requires you to have some clarity about what you want to say and how you want to say it. Also, another common misconception is that we think that we have to get it right and perfect the first time around, which is absolutely not the case. We often forget that writing is a very iterative process, meaning that you might need a lot of editing until you reach a text that successfully conveys your message. Remember that the first draft is only here to put our ideas into words and to get us into the flow of writing. But the second, the third, or even fourth draft are here to catch all the mistakes and make our text easy to follow and easy to understand. So without further ado, let's go over some tips about how to instantly improve your writing. The first advice that I can give to someone who is starting to write is to use straightforward statements. What does that mean? This means that very often in the attempt to sound more academic, we use very complex statements and explanations. And of course, scientific and technical disciplines need to be precise and sometimes use expressions that are very specific to their field. But that does not mean that we should not try to make it easier for the reader. And I'll give an example of it. And this example is completely made up, but I believe that you could come across something similar in many articles. So the complicated version goes like this. A cell is a fundamental unit of life, constituting the smallest structural and functional entity within living organisms, whether unicellular or part of a multicellular organism. In contrast, if we use a straightforward statement, the same sentence would sound something like this. A cell is the basic unit of life found in all single-celled or multicellular organisms. As you can notice, the second version gives the exact information as the first one, but in a much more concise way. And remember that everyone appreciates a clear and straightforward explanation. The next advice to write more fluently is to avoid passive sentences. This one took me quite some time to get used to because we tend to associate the use of passive sentences to something less personal and more professional or scientific. So let's see how that looks in an example. Instead of saying, the experiment was conducted by the research team to investigate the effects of temperature on enzyme activity, one could use the following sentence. We conducted the experiment to investigate how temperature affects enzyme activity. And it might seem weird and a little bit informal in the beginning, but believe me that it makes a huge difference when understanding the text. And if the use of active sentences makes you uncomfortable, like it was my case when I first started noticing my excess and overuse of passive, you can start by just including a few active sentences here and there. Another good way to get more used to writing sentences in the active form is to scan for passive and active sentences in the articles you read. Take an article and just read the first few paragraphs by consciously observing whether the sentences are written in active or passive form. You will realize pretty quickly that it is much easier to read articles written in active than in passive sentences. And this brings me to another practice that is also quite common, which is to write acronyms without any explanation. This actually happened to me last week. I was doing a literature research for a topic I'm studying, and I found a paper whose title looked very promising, and I thought it was exactly what I was looking for. But when I started reading, I realized that the authors were using acronyms without any explanations all the time. At first, I thought that I must have missed the explanation of the acronym, but when I read the text again, I realized that there is actually no explanation of the acronym anywhere in the text. Of course, that I didn't continue reading, and instead I searched for another paper that could explain the things I was trying to understand. So a good practice is definitely to include the entire definition of the acronym when you first mention it. And this can be tricky, especially if there are acronyms that are standard in your field and you are very used to using them in your work. But what happens when you don't explain an acronym? It actually creates a lot of friction between the text and the reader is much less likely to continue reading something they don't understand. And finally, I want to close this episode by talking about long sentences. Long sentences can be very hard to digest, especially if your native language is not English. It is very easy to keep the sentence form and structure of your own language and then translate it to English, which sometimes makes the sentence unnecessarily long. One good rule of thumb of how long a sentence should be is that one sentence should only explain one idea. Also, if you are more of a quantitative kind of person, there are several so-called readability scores that can help you with that. Readability scores are basically scores that assess how readable your text is by taking into account the length of the sentences, construction of the sentence, and so on. There are several different readability scores, and you can find many readability score calculators online to check how readable your text is. After some time checking it, you will already get some experience and some sense of how long a sentence should be to make your text easy to read. And finally, remember that writing is an iterative process that requires a lot of editing from the first draft to a final document. During editing, try to constantly ask yourself if there is a way of making it simpler, easier, and more understandable for your reader. When writing, we should always have the reader in mind, because at the end of the day, we are trying to teach our reader something about a topic we know a lot about. And our text has to be instructive and to some extent easy to digest. So next time you will need to sit down and write about your science, try to remind yourself what your reader needs. And just by asking yourself this question, you are on a great path to make reading your article an easy and enjoyable process. Thank you for listening, and until next time. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you are ready to elevate your communication skills and transform your data into valuable insights, schedule a free discovery call on the link in the description.